That's it. All right, we are going to get started. We're in Genesis 21. We're getting to the halfway point of the book of Genesis, and now, after 9 chapters, I guess, we've finally gotten to the arrival of the promise that God's promised way back since chapter 12. We had a detour starting around chapter 19 and 20, where the events that took place in the year between when God came and announced that he was going to, that Sarah was actually going to have a son, and then some events took place, destruction of the cities of the plain, and then an event with Abraham and Abimelech and Sarah, and some deceitfulness and all of that. But throughout it all, the point is that God has said he's going to do something, and then he's continually acted in a way to bring that about. And that's a theme in Genesis. And he's done it through or around or in spite of the goof-ups and the poor decisions and the outright sin of some of the very people that he's dealing with. And that's another theme in Genesis, is God's will gets accomplished despite humans' best efforts to thwart it, all throughout. Genesis, actually, that's the roots of the entire Bible, Revelation. And so now we're picking up after Abraham has been blessed by this king that he met in the last chapter, who he's living in his land, the land of the Philistines, sort of the northern Sinai Peninsula, towards the coast, inland a little bit. And he's living there in this land of Gerar. And there's a king, the Abimelech. It's sort of a title, not really a name. And that king had initially was going to take Sarah as his wife to probably to consolidate his alliance with this powerful nomadic herdsman named Abraham. Remember, Abraham's not just an old guy wandering around in a tent. He's a man with vast wealth, vast resources, a large army who was able to rout 5 other kings in the previous chapter, 4 other kings in the previous chapter. So Abraham is a force to be reckoned with, and wanting to, I guess, get on his good side or get in good with him or solidify a bond with him, Abimelech was going to marry Abraham's sister, Sarah. And we saw how God intervened in that last chapter and said, protected Abimelech's people from sinning, from committing the sin of adultery and taking the wife of another man. And also how Abraham kind of got humbled and chastised a little bit by Abimelech, who it turned out this pagan king was more righteous in this case than the chosen heir of the promise. So we'll pick it up now in 21, and it starts off, it says, answer, tell them to listen in. Genesis 21. It says, Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he promised. That word was gracious too. If you have NIV, it's the word is pakad in Hebrew. It's visited or saw to, or it's translated different ways. I don't exactly know when NIV says it translates the word gracious, but basically the Lord showed back up, made good on his promise. The Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave him the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. All right, so first of all, the circumcision. This was something we saw earlier, a few chapters back, when God instituted this covenant. Said this is going to be the covenant. All of the members of your family are going to be circumcised. And tell them they can come and listen. I should have asked them. The covenant with Abraham that God instituted was for his promised people to all be circumcised. And what that was inclusion in the covenant community. It was a mark in their flesh for them to be part of the people of God. And so Abraham does that this time when Isaac is a few days old. And then And when Abraham at this point is 100 years old. How old was Abraham when the promise was first given to him? To leave? 75 years old. Yeah. So, put that in perspective. This has been 25 years since God has promised Abraham that he would do this. 25 years. What were you doing 25 years ago? All right. I was 11. I was playing with G.I. Joes in my backyard 25 years ago. That's the extent of time that's passed from when God made the promise to when the promise finally happens. We have this idea in the Bible that God's just running around doing miracles everywhere, and that people are just waking up and talking to God every day, and stuff's happening. We read the story. We forget that there are huge gaps of time between these events. Massive gaps of time. There's 25 years of wandering in the desert, of fighting battles, of arguing with kings over his sister/wife. 25 years of this before these promises come to bear. So when I read stuff like that, it helps me to be a little more patient. When I start to think, okay, God, you need to keep your promise. You need to do what you're going to do. You need to, whatever it is, whatever we want to see done. We tend to think in the here and the now, rather than 25 years. Or back in Genesis 15, when God said, hey, Abraham, know this for certain, your descendants are going to be slaves in a foreign land for 400 years. And then after that, I'll bring them back. So God's timetable, much bigger than our timetable. So it's one of the things that helps us when we start to get impatient or we start to want to see results immediately. Reading these biblical narratives and reflecting on how God's acted in the past towards people is really helpful. So, Abraham, 100 years old. Nobody in here is 100, are they? I don't think we've got anybody. So, see, you're all still young. Still very fertile compared to Abraham. So, just think. Brand new dad, 100 years. And verse 6, Sarah said, God has brought me laughter. Literally, that's what Isaac's name means, is laughter, or he laughs. God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I've borne him a son in his old age. So there's this sense of like, finally, it's happened. And Sarah at this time is about 90, and so she's no spring chicken either. I mean, it's a miracle in every sense of the term. It's absolutely miraculous, and it's joyful. And then now it's going to sort of take a different twist. Verse 8, the child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. Now, just pause right there. So, just in that verse, about 3 years went by. See how fast the Bible narratives go? Just in that one verse. I mean, that's about how long it takes before children in the ancient Near East were weaned, between 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, somewhere along that line, maybe 4 or 5. And so, during this time, Isaac now has become a toddler. And Abraham, remember, still has another son. And Abraham's son, Ishmael, was, last time we saw him, the whole command to be circumcised chapter, he was 13 at that point. So by this time, Ishmael is probably about between 15 and 17 years old, a young man. All right, that's another detail to keep in mind, because a lot of people read this and they think of Ishmael as his baby, and Isaac is his other baby, and which baby's your favorite, and that kind of stuff. But by this point, Ishmael is old enough to start to, he's on his way to becoming a man, if not already. Verse 8, child grew and was weaned. Okay, verse 9. But Sarah saw that the son Hagar the Egyptian had born to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abram, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. Now, all along, Abraham has been raising Ishmael, the son of Hagar. And whose idea was it to begin with? It was Sarah's idea that Hagar should be the way that God gives her a child. It was a bad idea. It was a dumb idea. It was a common idea in the ancient world, but when you're dealing with God himself, who's promised that he's going to bring it about, and you start to get antsy and try to help God, try to help him along. Sarah thought maybe God needs some help in bringing about what he said he's going to do. That's when things go bad. And it introduced into the family this discord It should never have been there. It shouldn't have been. It introduced into the family that was supposed to be the woman and the man will become one flesh. That's the plan from Genesis. That was the beginning plan, was the two will become one flesh. And now, here we have in Scripture, we're about to have the first divorce. And it happens as the result of people taking what God had given in the terms of marriage and then the two becoming one flesh, and either modifying it or adding to it, or in some way, shape, or form, doing it in their way rather than how God had promised. And so when later in the New Testament, Jesus is going to be flat out asked about the issue of divorce, and the scribes and the Pharisees are going to come to him, and they're going to ask him about it, and they're going to use examples from later in the Torah, from what Moses is going to tell. And based on things like the life of the patriarchs and their families' messiness. And rather than even addressing that, Jesus will point the audience all the way back to Genesis. He'll take them all the way back to Genesis chapter 3 and the creation, chapter 2, the creation of man and woman. And he'll say, basically, that was God's intended purpose. Everything that happens after that is God allowing for human wickedness and creating a society that acknowledges that sin is in the world and is real and takes care of victims and people that are helpless the best they can. But the intention, it was always falling short of the true intention of marriage, which was one man and one woman. And so we'll see that in the beginning in this narrative, the family discord that's brought. So Sarah now, basically she sees Ishmael. We don't know what he's doing. NIV says mocking. Who's got something that's not NIV in here? I know there's some King James people. What do you have? Good news, playing. Okay, that's even a lighter version. Scoffing. Okay. Yeah. Anything else? Laughing. Yeah. It is the verb form for laughter. It is the verb form of, she basically is a wordplay. It says Isaac, she saw Ishmael Isaacing him, so to speak. So there is a wordplay going on. But the word laughter, it's an intensive format, and sometimes it can mean mockery, sometimes it can mean harassment, sometimes it can mean persecution, sometimes it can mean abuse. So it's a term that has a wide range of meanings, and basically it'll be up to context to determine what it is. And in this case, we don't have a lot of context. We just know that what Sarah saw, she saw him doing, and she didn't like it. So was he just playing with him? Probably not. Was he just joking around, good-natured teasing? Probably not. Later in Galatians 4, Paul's going to appeal back to this story. And he's actually going to talk about the older son who persecuted the younger son. He's going to use the form persecution. So whatever Ishmael is doing at this point to Isaac, it's more than just playing around. It could be anything from mocking, scoffing, deriding, looking down upon, like, who's this new kid? I'm the true heir. I'm the firstborn of Abraham. It could have been something like that, or it could have been all the way up to ridiculing or even abuse, even physical abuse, even roughhousing or picking on him or anything like that. So we don't even know exactly what's going on, but we know that Sarah doesn't like it, and she says, basically, send her away. Send her out of here. Now, this is the second time she's asked for this to be done. First time, Abram did it. Abram said, you take care of it. She's your maidservant. And Sarah sent her away, and then God said, nope, go back. This time, God's going to kind of, once again, it's going to be a little different. Verse 11, the matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, do not be so distressed about the boy and your maidservant. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it's through Isaac that your seed will be reckoned. I will make the son of the maidservant into a nation also, though, because he is your seed. So now this line of promise, the seed of Abraham, that's the promise all the way through has been about the seed of Abraham, who's the seed of the woman. That term seed is translated offspring or descendants, but it means what it means in English, seed, everything from physical, egg, sperm type seed, to seeds that you put on the ground, to metaphorically your descendants. Now the promise to the seed of Abraham is splitting off. And one of the seed of Abraham is going to be split off into another people. God saying, I'm going to take care of them. But your seed, this promised offspring, this promised covenant descendant is going to continue through Isaac. So it's going to split off. Right here, Abraham has two sons, and the promised covenant blessing splits off. And it's given to the younger, not to the older. It doesn't mean God doesn't like Ishmael. In fact, we see that God does like Ishmael. We're going to see what happens after this. It doesn't mean that Ishmael is the hated son and Isaac's the loved son. It doesn't even mean that when Jacob and Esau come along. The language of Jacob I loved, Esau I hated is Hebrew idiom for priority or purpose. We'll get to that later in Genesis. But the point is that God is choosing which avenue of descendants He's going to carry forth His promised plan. His promised plan hasn't changed. It's been there from the beginning to restore the nations that have gone astray back to fellowship with God through the separation that sin has brought into the world. And He's going to put His people, Abraham, the seed of the woman, the seed of Abraham, in that position to be the mediator between God and the nations. That's the plan, that's the covenant, that's the purpose, and that's what this blessing is being carried on for. We can't ever lose sight of that when we start to read the Old Testament as just God's record of dealing with the Israelites because He likes them so much, or they're the chosen people, or whatever. There's a purpose behind all of it. There's a worldwide purpose. God is creating a people that are going to be His priests to the nations, His intercessors, His people standing in the gap. And He's doing it through this family of Abraham. So He says, basically, allow Hagar to go. Basically, He says, send her away. And that verb to send away is the same verb that means to divorce. Later in the Bible, Malachi 3, the same verb would be to describe divorce. And this is a case where this marriage, and it was a marriage, Sarah gave Hagar as a second wife, so she got promoted from concubine maidservant to wife status once the son was brought into the picture. Now, God is saying that marriage, that joining was illegitimate to begin with, so separate it. It's time to separate it off. They're both old. They're going to be cared for. I'm going to take care of them. But Ishmael and Hagar have to go because the covenant promise that was given from the beginning is going to be carried on. So now in this, the question that's going to raise is some tensions like, well, what does that mean for Hagar and Ishmael? They just, see you later, you're off into the desert. Like, it seems like that's pretty callous from God's perspective. But again, we know, and we're going to see throughout, that God always takes care of the innocent. And He always protects the ones who need protection. And He never punishes the sons for the sins of the father. These are the attributes of God that we've seen throughout Genesis and will continue to see throughout Genesis. So when we come to these sections like, well, why is God all of a sudden saying, yes, send her away? That seems kind of unfair. What's going on there? When we come to those, that's when we have to keep in mind the God that we know, and we have to let that tension remain. How can this God that we know to be one way seem to command to do something that seems so different? And we'll see in a minute what His plan is with Ishmael. So, verse 13, I will make the son of the maidservant into a nation also because he is your seed. 14, early the next morning, Abraham took food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders, and then he sent her off with the boy. That's the verb for to send away. It means literally to send away. It can also mean to officially divorce, to send away with a certificate of marriage. In other words, she was not to be seen as damaged goods. She was sent away in full blessing. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. Now we'll get to Beersheba in just a minute. That's a place name that's been mentioned here that we don't know where it is so far. We're going to find out in the very next section. Verse 15. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down nearby, about a bow shot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there nearby, she began to sob. Or, if you have some translations say, he began to sob. The Hebrew Bible at this point says that she began to sob or began to weep. And the Greek version, the Septuagint, that was written long before Jesus, it has he began to sob. So, at this point, to set the image, Hagar, Ishmael, wandering in the desert near Beersheba, down in southern Israel. It's in the dry area, the Negev. It's rocky, it's mountainous, it's dirty, it's dry. It's a mountain desert, basically. And so they're wandering, we don't know for how long, but she had a skin of water, which were, if you've never seen it, they take the skin of a goat that they use for food or whatever, and they basically sew up, like you cut the legs off and sew those up. And you pull out everything, and all, you skin it, and cut the head off, and sew that in. And so basically, you have just a filled-up goat water balloon. Like that's what an animal's water skin is. It's a little cleaner than that description, but that's the volume of water. It's a goat filled with water that you drink out of. That's the skin that they're talking about. So, given that runs out, they've been out there for a long time. Again, a long thing happens in the span of just one verse. They're wandering in the wilderness and they end up running out of water. Presumably, Abram sent them, or Hagar went off in the direction of a well, because there is a well at Beersheba, and we'll find out about it in just a minute. Presumably, they went wandering and were going to make it to that well, refill, move on to the next stop, wherever that was, Egypt or maybe up in Canaan somewhere. That's sort of how you travel in the ancient Near East. It's like filling up your car for gas. You go as far as you can. When you start to run low, find a gas station, pull over, and fill up. It's like that way with water. So at this point, they've been wandering. They either missed the well, they went in the wrong direction, the water's run out. And Ishmael, by this point, is, for whatever reason, can't really walk on his own. It says she goes and sets him under a bush. In other words, he's exhausted. He's worn out. He's at the point of death. She's at the point of death. This isn't like the next day. Okay, this is a long time in the desert. And so she finds some shade, puts Ishmael under the shade, lays him down there, and then says, what mother can watch her teenage son die and not be just grieved? And so she says, I can't watch. And so she goes, and then one of them, or probably both of them, are either crying or crying out or weeping, or just, they're at death's door. This is the end. It seems a very pitiful and terrible way to go after spending their whole life with Abraham and Sarah. Verse 17.
Hey, Jay,
yes?
What's that word, bow shot? What's that?
Shoot an arrow. As far as it lands, about that far away.
So 50 yards or 30 yards.
Yeah, a good archer can maybe do 100 or so. Yeah. Depends on what type of bow and how strong the archer is. But yeah, it's not like from me to you. It's like, I'm going to go away. I'm leaving, I'm going away. Verse 17, here's the kicker though. God heard the boy crying. That's kind of why people think he was crying rather than she was crying. But regardless, God heard the boy crying. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what's the matter, Hagar? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy to drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. So now, God comes once again, just like he did last time Hagar was in the desert alone and scared and thought she was about to die. God shows up and says, I've got you. This is all, you're not outside of my will. She's outside of the covenant people. She's been cast out from the covenant people, but she's not outside of the will of God, because God is always bigger than his covenant people. Doesn't mean he's not primarily working through his covenant people. He is, but he still is active outside of his covenant people. And that's something that Christians often we miss or we don't wrap our minds around, is God's doing stuff outside of what he's doing in the pages of the Bible. We get glimpses of it, and we get hints of it, and we meet these characters every now and then. They come on the scene and let us know God is active outside the bounds of his people in some way. That's all we get. We don't get a full theology of how. We don't know how, for instance, in Numbers, a guy named Balaam, a pagan prophet, is going to actually have a legitimate relationship with God. That he does. We don't know how that happens. We don't know how Melchizedek, who we met back in earlier chapters, how he was a priest of the Lord Most High, and how he had a relationship with God. We don't know. We don't know the fate of those outside of the covenant people, but we get enough glimpses to know that the covenant God is the judge of all the earth, who will do what is right. In this case, he does that. And he says, the text goes out of its way to say God was with the boy as he grew up. Ishmael was cut off from the particular covenant promise, but he wasn't cut off from the care of God, the Heavenly Father. He was cared for. God was with him. It wasn't God saying, you're not part of the chosen, get out of here, I'm done with you. We see that in this. We see the heart of God for those outside of covenant, and it's something that's really important. There's no hint in this text. There's no hint in the earlier text of what would later develop around the idea of this is where the conflict in the Middle East can all trace itself back to Genesis. I was just over in Israel a couple weeks ago, in Palestine and in Israel, and meeting people in both, and wonderful people, and people that want peace, and they really don't have anything against each other. It's the governments and the people that hold the machine guns that they don't like, and or the people that set the bombs, or the people that shoot the rockets, or whatever. But observers from outside will always look at situations like that in the Middle East and say, well, it's as old as the Bible. No, it's not. That's not true at all. There's not, this conflict doesn't start in Scripture. It doesn't go that far back. That's a later Quran invention and historical idea that got caught on somehow and perpetuated. It's not. God cares about and he looks after, and he wants peace, and he wants prosperity, and he wants love, and he wants joy and happiness, and all those things that he wants for us, he wants for everybody else too. And that's what he calls us to work for in this life, regardless, and not just say, well, it all goes back to the Bible, so nobody can figure it out, so let's just not worry about it. That's the easy way out, and that's the wrong way. But instead, what we see here is the splitting and the bringing into being of what will later become the Ishmaelites. These wandering desert nomad traders that had ties with Egypt, because Ishmael's wife's an Egyptian and his mother was an Egyptian, but they also have ties with Canaan, because his father is Abraham, and he's going to be in the land of Canaan. And so the Ishmaelites would sort of be this caravanning people that would go between Egypt and Canaan. I'm doing it the wrong way here. You guys would say. Between Egypt and Canaan on the trade route. That's what we'll see later. But Joseph, who gets sold into slavery by his brothers, will sell him to traveling with the Ishmaelites, who will take him down to Egypt. So these peoples are starting to come into being in this land that we're going to know for the rest of the Bible. But what about this place, Beersheba, where Abraham, or where they were wandering? Verse 22, we'll jump back into it, and this last little section sort of gives us how that came to be what it is. At that time, Abimelech, who we've met before, and Phicol, the commander of his forces, so Abimelech and his right-hand general, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do. Now swear to me before God that you will not deal falsely with me or any of my children or my descendants. Show to me in the country where you're living as an alien the same kindness I have shown to you. Abraham said, I swear. Again, the promise to Abraham originally in Genesis 12 was you'll be a blessing. You'll be a great nation. Those who bless you I will bless. Those who curse you I will curse. We're starting to see this happening little by little in Abraham's life. Verse 25, then Abraham complained to Abimelech, or brought up this sore spot that they had, about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. But Abimelech said, I don't know who's done this. You didn't tell me, and I heard about it only today. So Abraham brought sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a treaty. Abraham set apart 7 ewe lambs from the flock, and Abimelech asked Abram, what's the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs you've set apart by themselves? He replied, accept these 7 lambs from my hand as a witness that I dug this well. So that place was called Beersheba, which means well of swearing, or well of an oath, because the 2 men swore an oath there. After the treaty had been made at Beersheba, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called upon the name of the Lord, the eternal God, El Olam. And Abraham stayed in the land of Philistines for a long time. So now this section ends. Abraham has gotten the main point of this blessing.